We have had a pretty heavy set of discussions over the past couple of days, and I think everybody anticipated this going in. We're talking about gun violence, we're talking about race, we're talking about juvenile issues, we're talking about dealing with police. Imagine dealing with this every single day. For some of you, that is a reality as reporters who cover crime. Every single day you are dealing with some of the worst things imaginable. For managers, you are sending your reporters out to deal with that every single day. We are all dealing with trauma in one way or another. Some of it's micro trauma that carries on, some of it is large trauma that sticks with us, but we're all dealing with it. And news managers here are often having to play the part of a leader and a counselor. And reporters are having to sort of process their own trauma as they try to empathize and contextualize the trauma of others. So I'm very excited for this next session with Melissa Kaiser. She is the founder of Melkai Consulting. Melissa is an independent consultant in the anti-human trafficking field. She's from North Dakota, but recently relocated to Florida the past couple of years, and will lead us in this discussion about mental health, how we can help process it in our own lives, how we can process that for others in our newsrooms, and help continue this discussion and process the trauma we all face. So please join me in welcoming Melissa to the stage.
Thank you. Good morning. Who wants to guess how cold it was the day I moved from North Dakota to Florida? Any guesses? Negative 40.
Oh my God.
Yes, I did say that right. So obviously, I always tell people when they say, why did you move? I said, well, I always make the joke, North Dakota doesn't have Wi-Fi or running water. So, but also I say, I don't want to live where the air hurts my face, literally walking outside. So this is not cold for me. In Florida, everyone's saying it's freezing here and it's 50. And I'm like, this is great. I'm still in shorts and all of the above. So again, my name is Melissa. Born and raised on a beef ranch in North Dakota. I'm a licensed social worker still in the state of North Dakota and helped start the Human Trafficking Task Force back in 2015. So prior to that, I worked in a lot of different areas of social work, treatment, foster care, psychiatric and addictions, youth homelessness, domestic violence, and then started working with victims and survivors of human trafficking. And I also was the first point of contact for the state anytime we suspected a victim of sex or labor trafficking. So continued to do that work on my own in Florida. I still work with the North Dakota Task Force, but now people call me from around the country to ask for help with their programming or their task force. What led me into the wellness piece, of course, just having that social worky background that's of interest to me, but I was working with teams throughout North Dakota. Part of my job was to create and maintain multidisciplinary teams. So when a victim was located, I would call that team, whether it's law enforcement, medical providers, so on and so forth, prosecutors, and say, hey, we've got a case, I need your help. What I started noticing on those teams is people were starting over time to just like treat victims differently. Maybe they were getting more impatient. Maybe they weren't showing up to meetings or it just didn't seem like they cared. And also for those team members that I got to know on a personal level, they were having struggles at home often. And I just thought, my gosh, there's something missing here. Like victims aren't getting the help they need because we're not even helping ourselves. And what's interesting is why I'm here, because I do this talk and I do consulting for this topic all over, but I was on a plane to provide this at a law enforcement conference. And there was a retired journalist from Minnesota named Kevin. If anyone knows a retired journalist from Minnesota named Kevin, please find me, because he was like, have you ever thought of journalist conferences? And I said, I have, because when I watch TV, I'm like, wow, you guys see a lot of stuff and I don't know how you deal with it. So he gave me the name of these conferences. This was 2 months ago, and that is literally why I'm here today. So if anyone knows him, very cool how networking and connections happen. So what I want to start with is we really need to normalize that you experiencing some feelings and emotions around the work that you do and the things that you see is normal. We often tell ourselves, like, we've got to be tough, we can't let this work impact us, we can't talk about it. You are human, you're going to have a human reaction when humans are suffering and you guys see them at their worst, okay? So I love to start with this quote: the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. I want you to take this with you, okay? Because we do this all the time where we repress it, we stuff it away, thinking that we shouldn't be affected, or maybe we're not good at our jobs if we let it impact us, and we have to remember we're humans, right? We're going to be impacted when you guys see the hardest struggles that people have, right? Just day to day. So remembering this as we go. One thing I like to talk about, sometimes I call this Newton's Law, this presentation, and it comes from a book called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement by Dr. Kevin Gilmartin. And the idea is, of course, Newton's Law being for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? And so, again, taking this with you to think about, you're at high stress levels all day, right? You guys have very high pressure jobs. You have to make quick decisions, right? And two themes I heard just sitting and observing yesterday were guilt and pressure. I feel like there's a lot of guilt and pressure in the work that you do. So you're going to take that home. And we go home and we assume that we just return to normal, right? Spend time with friends and family, go home, make dinner, hang out. And we forget that we have to cope with the negative emotions each day. And so again, understanding that when your actions or your daily experiences at work expose you to trauma, you're going to have a reaction to that. There's going to be a result from that because we're on like high or low all the time. So again, remembering that that makes you human. People in your profession struggle with this. Of course, my profession struggle with this. I could tell you so many stories about that for myself and for others. But again, just remembering, okay, what is going to impact me from this action at work? You know, what's my reaction when I get home? So I want you to think about this. I would even encourage you, I know yesterday you said that a lot of you go back and like you debrief, you talk, you have meetings within your teams, and if you're comfortable talking about these things, right? How has the work changed you? How has it impacted you? For me personally, working in human trafficking, 99% of the offenders I've seen over the last almost decade are men, and I have a really hard time, like if I'm sitting at a park and a guy is with two kids, it's probably their dad, probably a babysitter, probably a very innocent situation. My first thought is like, what's his intention? He's a pervert, he's grooming those kids. That's how my mind works. I know that's not normal, but I've been exposed to so much trauma, that's how my worldview has shifted. You all are gonna have that in your own way, right? And so I want you to think about that. Imagine if you were in a profession completely outside of this, like you're a car mechanic, you're a financial analyst. Do you think you'd view the world the same as you do now with what you know? You can't unknow that information. And there's positive and negative to that. Like the thing I love about my work, I have a 1-year-old daughter, and as much as that scares the crap out of me, I feel like I'm going to keep her so much safer because of the things I know about the world, about social media, I'm just very hyper-vigilant about my environment. I know how to have hard conversations with her. Those are really great things that we all get out of the type of work you're exposed to. On the flip side, I could not enjoy Bourbon Street last night because every child playing the drums, I'm like, that's child exploitation. Like, someone take this poor kid home. Like, where's law enforcement, right? And that's supposed to be an environment that people are enjoying. Like, cool, look at this talented kid. And I'm like, hello, red flags. So it's just remembering, like, your whole worldview is going to be shifted because of what you do. That's exhausting, right? And so I want you to think about that. And again, if you're comfortable, bring this back to the newsroom, to where you work, and have these conversations and be open to it, being aware of this, because just having a different perspective on the world is exhausting in and of itself, right? And it burns us out of our jobs. And I think also, what do you do with the stories you hear at work? One thing I used to do a lot is what's called word vomiting, and I would say too much that I'm like re-traumatizing people with my horrific stories about the work I was doing. I didn't know how to process that. I didn't know what to do with that, and in my world so much has to be held confidential because I'm working with victims. And so it was like, well, how do I hear these horrific things and just keep that down? And I would, go in the lunchroom and say, oh my God, this trafficker did this horrific thing. And I would just talk and talk and talk about it. And even though other people are in the same work as me, that doesn't mean we want to keep hearing about it all the time, right? And so how can we limit that? How can we be aware of that? On the flip side, for some of you, you probably do stuff it away, those stories you hear at work. That's going to come back up in some way, shape, or how. For some people, it's coping with alcohol. Some people, it's that they get really depressed. Whatever that is, if you stuff it away and don't process it and try to just compartmentalize it, you're going to see that come out in some other way in your life. And then were you trained for this? So even in social working school, we weren't trained for how are you going to be impacted by this work, which is kind of crazy, right? I'm sure you guys weren't necessarily either. And so it's thinking about, do we have this type of training, wellness, awareness, and information where we work? Because if not, there are really easy ways to implement that. Not necessarily just bringing in trainers, but there's resources that exist. And I provided a lot of them to you guys through the resources that you'll be shared with after this conference. So really quick crash course. Here are various terms that you might be impacted by. I feel like we umbrella all of these under the word burnout. Okay, burnout is one tiny part of this. You can have all of these at the same time. You can have one of them. They can come and go. It's not like once you have this, you're stuck with it forever. It's just things that you might be struggling with. So secondary traumatic stress is a big one we'll talk about today. But again, these are just a list of the different things I want you to consider. PTSD, that's post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm sure you know that, but just in case. So that's like when it reaches a mental health diagnosis. And so just to go through these real quick, burnout can happen in any job. It doesn't have to be what we do every day. This is it could be a car mechanic, it could be a financial analyst. It's just that overworked, underpaid, I'm not passionate about what I do, my boss is mean to me, I don't have a purpose here, I'm really frustrated with where I work, right? You can have this anywhere you work. We've all had jobs where we are just burnt out and kind of over it. Changing jobs helps us go away, right? We're just burnt out. It's just not for us. We've lost our passion here. PTSD, again, post-traumatic stress disorder, that is when you have so much of the trauma we're going to talk about that it's just now to the point of being a mental health diagnosis. It's impacting your ability to function daily, okay? Maybe you're having flashbacks, you're having nightmares or night terrors that keep you up at night. You're avoiding certain person, places, things, okay? So when it starts to really, really become like this recurrence of stress and anxiety, avoidance, where it impacts your daily functioning, you might have post-traumatic stress disorder from your work. And it doesn't matter that it's secondhand, right? We don't have to be directly involved in the trauma to still be traumatized by it. Compassion fatigue, that is when it's literally what it sounds like. You're completely eroded of giving compassion. So in my job, very common, right? When I was a supervisor at a domestic violence agency, the phones rang 24/7. And this was in Fargo, North Dakota. It's not like it's a massive population of people, and to still work somewhere where the phone is ringing constantly and it's new people, new women all the time, all you do is answer phone calls of crying people who are in danger, who need you, who are in very traumatic, stressful situations, and you're giving all day long to walk-in appointments, to phone calls. And so just thinking about in your line of work where you see that, where it's you're just giving empathy all the time, where you just get exhausted of giving all the time. And so this happens where people, again, start to be, where I see in my line of work, irritable, impatient, they're kind of not paying attention. They start to predetermine situations. So again, working with victims of human trafficking, people would just kind of make assumptions about the cases after a while because you've seen so much and you've been so compassionate that once you lose that ability, you just start to make assumptions and treat everything the same. And you forget that each person that comes to you has their own trauma, has their unique needs, because we're just eroded of giving that compassion all the time. And obviously with compassion fatigue, because of that giving, it's that extreme self-sacrifice, and then you kind of forget how to empathize. My partner, he's in law enforcement, and this is one of our struggles, is he has a loss in empathy because of his job, right? And so when I was not an emotional person until I became pregnant, and then I was crying about literally anything. And so he would come home, and he would have, 4 domestic violence calls, and I'm coming home crying that I don't know, I couldn't figure out the washing machine. I mean, it could have been the stupidest little thing. And he had nothing to give me. And I'm I'm crying, I need you. And he's I can't, I don't have it in me. And so that for our relationship caused a lot of tension when I was pregnant, because he wasn't used to me emoting so much, either was I. But then he was just so exhausted that he didn't want to come home some days, because he's my God, what is it today? My unpredictable emotions. Secondary traumatic stress. This is that initial, like, you've been now exposed to someone's in their trauma indirectly, and it's starting to impact you. Like, you're getting that secondhand trauma. You're starting to even have traumatic responses like victims of trauma do. We can have those same types of reactions, right, to things that you'll see in victims. This is where you see people in really physical or emotional distress, right? You're listening to heart-wrenching stories. You're witnessing injuries. I mean, this is stuff you guys do all the time. So you're traumatized, again, secondhand, right, from the trauma that you deal with. And then that turns into vicarious trauma. I typically use the terms interchangeably, but they are a little different, where vicarious trauma is that, like, constant secondhand trauma. This is where that worldview shift happens for you. So again, for me, that, like, I see a situation like where men are involved with children or women, and I'm immediately like, what are you doing? Which is so unfair, right? And I know that. I know it's an irrational thought. I don't like that I have that thought, but my worldview has been shifted, okay? That's where that vicarious trauma, when you're exposed over and over and over again, you get those intrusive thoughts, right, about different things. I might be sitting down and something reminds me of an old case I had, and it's like, oh, I didn't need to be, I didn't need that image to go through my head today, but it just, you can't help it, right? Things remind us of things that we've seen. Difficult repeated exposure, certainly that impacts our sense of self. Again, the guilt and pressure that you all have in your jobs. And then the other thing, lastly, that I won't go into much today, but moral suffering is something we don't think about either. There's moral injury, there's moral distress. Moral injury first came out of military, and if you guys are interested, you can dig into this. Moral distress came out of healthcare. And some examples from my field of work is, let's say my partner in law enforcement acts in a manner using force, and I did not feel that that was appropriate or right. Like, morally, that's impacting me, because I'm like, I do not think that's right. I do not agree with their actions, just because of my own moral compass. For me in social work, for the moral distress piece, the hardest thing is if you build a relationship with a client or a victim and they tell you something that's reportable. Like, ethically, like, as a social worker, I have to report certain things to law enforcement or certain things to child protection when they happen. I have to tell victims and clients this information. Hey, I'm a mandated reporter, that's what this means. But there are still times where they'll tell you things they might forget or not realize. And then I'm like, I have to report this, but it is going to shatter their trust in the system that I've worked so hard to build. And morally, it just kills me, because I'm like, there's probably nothing that can be done at this time with this report, but as a social worker, I have to do it. And I know that this client's probably never going to call me again, and we worked so hard to get here. It's a really, really, for me, damaging, like, I lose sleep over type of situations, right? Because morally, that's a struggle for me internally. So thinking about, for you, where do you see these things happen? That moral piece of difference of opinion, right, in some of these things. So some quotes that I hear, I've heard doing this work, I miss feeling my emotions, right? This came from a jail administrator, and he's like, I just don't emote anymore. I hear victims come in through the jail, they have horrific stories, and it doesn't impact me. Again, compassion fatigue, right? You're so fatigued of giving and being empathetic. When my wife has, something she comes to me with, movies, nothing makes me cry, nothing makes me have any emotion, and I miss feeling that. I'm mean to my kids, I hear that a lot. I have a hard time relaxing, I'm married to my job, gory scenes in movies don't faze me, nobody's redeemable. That's that compassion fatigue, right, of like, we can't save anybody, they're all going to relapse, so they're all going to go back to their trafficker. If they're homeless, they're always going to be homeless. Just this idea of like, our jobs are pointless. I had empathy when I first started this job, okay? So those are things I hear in different variations often. The last three are things that we do that drive me crazy. It is what it is. I'm good, I signed up for this work, gotta deal with it, right? Like if I would have a case and afterwards I'd call law enforcement and be like, hey, I noticed you were a little quiet in that meeting, you're a little off, what's going on? This is just what I gotta do, doesn't matter. One of my friends is a Homeland Security investigator, and I called him a while back just to, hey, how are you, what's new? And he works child pornography cases, and he has 2 little kids at home. And when I was talking to him, and he was telling me, oh, it is what it is, it could be worse. I'm like, Sean, did you hear what you just said? It could be worse. You work child pornography cases. It isn't worse than that. Like, you have to think about that. Like, there is nothing worse than your job that you have to view this stuff all day, every day, and then go home to your children. Like, that's how desensitized, you have to put that on, right? Could be worse. And so it is what it is, I'm fine. And it's like, we're not fine. We have to talk about it. Sometimes we're fine, but sometimes we're not fine. This idea of throw them into the wolves, that's how I had to learn, right? Give them the tough cases, give them the tough stories, toughen their skin mentality. And then we have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and get over it. Okay, those types of things. And again, there are moments where we do have to be tough. We do have to go do our jobs because we're here, we're passionate about it, we care. However, that doesn't mean we can't have feelings about it, right? And so just identifying that, if this is a culture thing in your workplace too that needs some work, maybe you're in a really supportive place that doesn't, and that's incredible because you're definitely ahead of the ball if that's the case. And I think for you, again, yesterday, two themes I really heard were guilt and pressure from a lot of the stories you all told. And similarly, what I have found, just doing some research into journalism and preparing for this too, this is where I saw a lot of commonalities with our profession. We can feel really defeated and discouraged. We get blamed a lot, right? Of course. There's little reward or acknowledgement, which can also add to that burnout, right? We take a lot of blame, like I said, we put ourselves in danger. I think what gets really, really tough too in professions like ours is we have to find this middle ground of like, there's only so many things we can control, right, in a story, in a situation, in experiments. And then we have to find from that, well, what really matters here? And again, for you guys having to make those decisions is really tough. And then where do they overlap? Because we can only focus on what matters, what can I control, and we get really overwhelmed sometimes with that, of like, where am I in this? And then lastly, if you even have access, do you guys have like free mental health services where you work, or EAP programs? Some of us do, some of us don't probably. If you're in leadership and or if you're not, this is something to certainly advocate for. I also think there's a fear of utilizing these services because of the fear of confidentiality breakdowns, but just know that therapists have guidelines. They can't, like, if you're having a hard day, they can't call your boss and be like, hey, Melissa showed up and she's a hot mess today, like, don't put her out on the, on the story. They can't do that unless you come in and sit down and say, I'm going to shoot my boss today, right? They obviously have to say that. They have to tell someone. The information you provide to them in those therapy sessions is confidential. They have ethics to uphold. They have a licensure to uphold, okay? So again, if you're unsure if that's holding you back, just ask for more information or details on that program, or if you know the counseling organization that provides that service to you, you can call too and inquire about that. I have free counseling through my agency. What does that look like, okay? And again, they can't tell anyone that information. So asking yourself, why don't I use that, especially if it's free, or especially if you have good insurance that gives you some sessions, why not use that? One thing I will tell you, therapists have therapists, you guys. For real. Therapists have therapists. Tiger Woods has a golf coach. Same concept. Like, just because these are our jobs, that doesn't mean we don't need help doing our jobs and getting through the day and processing these things. It doesn't make you, it's not something to be ashamed or embarrassed of, right? To have these services, that's why they exist. So just consider those things, or again, more normalizing it where you work, that these exist. If they do exist, and people, like what I hear, lots of people like, I had no idea we even had that. Why doesn't your team, why don't your employees know that exists? That should be something that's regularly reminded, talked about, right? So on and so forth. I just found this on Instagram and I loved it. We need to stop glamorizing overworking, please. Right? Don't we all do this? The absence of sleep, good diet, exercise, relaxation, time with friends and family is not something to be applauded. Too many people wear their burnout as a badge of honor, and it needs to change. That is so true. This was me a few years ago. I also worked for the state law enforcement agency in North Dakota, creating their first victim witness program. I had 3 phone numbers. I had one for that program, I had the human trafficking hotline, and then my personal number, which all my team, that's how people got a hold. Everyone knows how to find you when they need to find you. Right? I was so proud of this, of people knew if they needed anything, any hour of any day, they can call me. right? But that burnt me out so quickly. And I just kept working through it because I do love what I do. I'm very passionate about it and I want to help people, but not taking those breaks, and then everyone like applauded that, and then it's like, well, we have to live up to this expectation, right? There's no boundaries at work. We're expected to answer email at midnight on a Friday. That idea, instead it's like, who are these people and are they okay? I can tell you one of the reasons I did this, it was a distraction for me. The more I was working, the more control I felt like I had, and the more I didn't actually think about the work I was doing. Like if I had one case, had a meeting, figured that out, that plan, checked the list, okay, now I take this phone call, now I do that, and now this victim needs me to follow up with them. If I took a break, I had to start thinking about the horrific things. The more I kept myself busy, the more distracted my brain was, okay? So just identifying this in you or maybe a colleague, and then checking in on those people, checking in on yourself. And if we don't have good boundaries at work, how can we create them? That's very hard to do. Just another food for thought. Once in a while, if we get really burnt out, there's this idea that there's we're either more absent or we're more present. So per my last example, that presenteeism, you're always at work, you never take breaks or vacation, it's always applauded, you're always available, people know that they can find you, okay? Or you're the opposite, is like you start to show up late, you miss too often, this person's always sick, right? They're not available, you can just feel that they're kind of checked out, okay? So again, that's just one of those things to consider when we're getting burnt out or we're struggling maybe with secondary trauma. Are we experiencing someone that's this absenteeism, this presenteeism, and we complain about that, cause some negativity around it versus saying, hey, are they okay? And starting to shift the way we look at these things. Not shockingly, but just something to think about, especially in leadership, 6 causes of burnout. The top 6, workload size, of course, perceived lack of control, lack of reward or recognition, poor relationships, lack of fairness, and a values mismatch. So again, nothing shocking, right, or earth-shattering, but I think it's just something to consider about the culture of where you work and looking at these things. And again, if you're in a leadership position or you're someone that reports to leadership, can you bring these 6 things and just check in on these things, right? What are we doing to alleviate some of the burnout? Do we, have plans or consider all 6 of these areas? One thing I like to talk about too, we have 55,000 on average thoughts a day, and not shocking to you all, over 80% are like negative, which again, in your line of work, that's not shocking, right? But it's sad. It's sad that so many of our thoughts each day are negative, and this is just another food for thought, something to bring back to the work. It's just kind of like a belief wheel, I call it. And so, like in my world, a belief might be held that nobody's redeemable, right? Like everyone's going to fail. All these clients we see, all these victims, they're all destined to not do well, basically. So once you're so burnt out, compassion fatigue, nobody's redeemable is your belief, okay? What thoughts might come with that of nobody's redeemable? Why am I here? This is a waste of my time. I'm annoyed, right? So kind of getting into those feelings, I'm frustrated, I'm annoyed, I'm angry, right? Nobody's redeemable. My thoughts are, why am I here wasting my time? Feelings, I'm annoyed, frustrated, angry. How are you going to behave then with your team, with those victims? You're probably going to be impatient, right? Dismissive. You're going to come off angry. So what do you think your result's going to be? They probably aren't going to call you back. They probably are going to go back because they feel unsupported. They feel like, why did I try to get help in the first place? Especially with victims of trafficking, there's a lot of shame. So when they come forward and try to talk, and then the person they're working with is rude, dismissive, doesn't want to be there, you think they're going to come back or be involved in that investigation or that support? No. So that reassures that belief. Nobody's redeemable. See, another case, another situation. So you're just proving yourself over and over and over again. Again, think of a belief that's consistent with your jobs, whether it's within your organization, whether it's you, okay? And this can even be personal. This can be a belief about yourself, about your family life. So not just taking this work, but taking this personal. What do you have beliefs about yourself? They're going to cause some mental health distress, okay? And think about these things, like even writing these down, like what are my thoughts, and how does this reassure my initial belief, and trying to flip the narrative on that, and again, bringing this back to your organization, to talk through some of these beliefs, especially with what you've heard over the last day and a half. There's some things probably that, stories we don't cover. What are the beliefs around that? Why don't we do that? Thinking about those in this way. So individual risk factors, what I really want you all to do here is start that assessment process about what is going to make me more resilient to these things when they happen to me, but then also why am I at risk? Like what makes me at risk in what situations of developing maybe some compassion fatigue, some vicarious trauma? What are your personal vulnerabilities? Do you identify with a marginalized population? Do you do a story where maybe the victim reminds you of your child? Right? That's a vulnerability. I got a divorce in the midst of working in human trafficking, and I will tell you, dating again was really challenging for me because it's like, I can't trust, like I told you guys earlier, I have a hard time trusting men, and so then I'm trying to date again, forget it. I'm like, what's their criminal record? What is their Facebook? Are they addicted to child pornography? It sounds crazy, but this is how my work has impacted me. That's a vulnerability that I carried into the workplace with me. Right? And so thinking about for your own self, maybe you're a victim yourself of abuse or trauma, okay? And how is that going to be a vulnerability in certain stories that your newsroom is running? Work-related traumatic grief and loss. Certainly you've had stories, and then like we talked about yesterday, the young male who was found dead next to the body of water. Somebody told that story. You're going to have traumatic grief and loss, and it's not necessarily even with the stories or, in my sake, the clients. I've lost countless clients to homicide, suicide, overdose, all of those things. It could even be like your favorite colleague leaves and goes somewhere else, and you're like, that was my one person. That can feel like a big grief, a big loss when you maybe just had like one sole person that you wanted to connect with at your job that you felt like was a support. Direct exposure to trauma, some of you will experience that, right, with being first on scene and some of those things and the stories you run. You might see have some direct exposure to trauma. Of course, today we're talking about all the indirect. System failures, that's a big one. You guys see it in a certain way, and I see in a certain way, right? What are the system breakdowns? What are the failures here? For me, a big one is like I might report something to Child Protective Services and they're doing their job, they just don't always have enough to respond or remove a child or what have you, right? That doesn't mean they're doing anything wrong because they have to follow certain guidelines of what we can prove, what the investigation looks like, but maybe I know I'm going to report something that the child is still going to be in an unsafe circumstance. Like those are the types of things that really weigh heavy on you. Or I know that this person needs this type of addiction treatment, but they don't have the right insurance, so therefore they're going to not get in. Those types of failures. For you all, what do you see with system failures that continues to impact you? And you know that. You see, we talked about it for the last day and a half, the failures within the system that you see every day that are going to fatigue you, frustrate you, make your jobs harder, right? Those things. Working conditions. That's a big one. Do you work in a positive supported agency? Do you work in a negative toxic place? For me, it could even be like I worked in a lot of nonprofits, and I always joked, funding is always so tiny. So it was like I had to beg for a pencil, if I needed something. Like just this idea of like funding was always so tight that was a really big stressor. I'm like, how do we help these clients? What can we do? Well, we need a donation, those types of things. And then certainly for you guys, the last one is huge. That's sociocultural context. I don't know if you've heard of COVID, right? But that changed a little bit the way you did your jobs, the community in which you live, what's going on within the community, the culture there, the war in Ukraine, these big things that happen that really change the political climate, certainly over the last few years has changed, right? Those are all going to impact you personally, and that's all going to impact your work, obviously. So thinking about these things, how am I at risk of developing compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma easier, right, is to focus on these areas and how this feels for you. So now switching gears, how do we now combat this, right? How do we become more resilient to it? There's so many tools out there, and again, you'll be provided some of those that I shared. You can always reach out to me. I have so much more, but these are things that have been statistically proven. to help, which seem obvious, but they're overlooked all the time. So a balanced and reasonable caseload, that's the verbiage in my world, right? Balanced and reasonable caseload. But for you all, it's similar. Like, how much work is on your plate, right? What are you all responsible for? What types of stories? What do you all have on your to-do task list? It's just to be more aware of this. If it's not balanced, are you talking regularly with your team, with your supervisor on, like, I have too much on my plate, how can we be more reasonable? How can, I get support? Are you talking ongoing about everyone having balanced and reasonable caseload size, or whatever you would call that in journalism world? Supervision and support. I've had so many jobs where I did not have a supportive supervisor, and that was really hard because, like you all, I had have a very high pressure job, making very big decisions sometimes about things that I should not do without support, and didn't have readily access, to that support in a supervisor and leadership, where I didn't know that they had my back in some of these decisions, and that causes a lot more burnout, right, and fatigue when you don't have that support. For those of you in leadership roles, I would always encourage you to find one-on-one time with employees, right? If you're not in leadership, can you advocate for that? And it's like, okay, I meet with Melissa every Thursday at 1, or whatever it is that's agreed upon. It's just that standing time. And when you do that as someone in leadership, please put your phone down, please turn your computer off, right? Because there was times where my supervisor was available and we'd schedule time, but her phone, her face was in her phone the whole time. I'm like, why am I here? Like, I'm the one working with the victims in the community, and you could care less about me, and I'm the one doing the work. It just felt icky, right? So just some food for thought there. Another protective factor that's proven to help is obviously time away from work. Vacation, we all earn it, we should take it. I think too, sometimes in our organizations we have this, oh, it must be nice mentality, where we kind of get eye-rolly. If Melissa's taking vacation, we gotta pick up the slack. But then when we take vacation, how crummy does that feel? That we're going on vacation, we already are concerned, like, what are they gonna say, or how frustrated are they gonna be with me? And again, how do we change that narrative in the workplace? We all deserve and need breaks from this work, okay? And those boundaries of when I'm on vacation, are people still getting a hold of me? Sometimes we have to, right? I get it. Sometimes that's just the way it is, but other times, especially if you're in a role of leadership, can you ensure that there's something in place so we respect boundaries when people are going on vacation, because we all need it, right? When that's not possible, other things I would suggest are just time away from high-stress work in general. So again, my partner being in law enforcement, he and I love watching like documentaries on like murder mysteries and the Jeffrey Epstein stuff. And I'm like, okay, we are literally not turning it off at all. So now our thing is like, if we can't find something to watch, we just put on stand-up comedy, because it's laughter, which is great. It's quick, it's easy. We just know it's something that is easy to watch and mindless. Okay, so it's even taking time away in that way of like, what are you watching? What are you reading after work? For me too, like scrolling on TikTok, all these myths about human trafficking come up. Like someone gets 3 million views and it's like zip ties on cars in parking lots, your children aren't safe. And I'm like, I cannot stand this. And I would just go down the rabbit hole of looking at comments and seeing people share this inaccurate information. And again, I'm not taking time away from high stress work after work. So again, holding yourself accountable to that. Even for me, I turn off my email notifications on my phone. I know I have emails. We all know we have emails. And it's this constant reminder with the red little number that keeps adding up, or the ding, ding, ding. Why? We know it's there. We know how to get to it if we need it. And frankly, if someone needs to get a hold of us, they know how to get a hold of us, if it's that important, if it's that urgent. So again, being more aware of that. Social support outside of work. My best friends are cops and social workers. What do you think we talk about over beer after work? Is work. So thinking about that in your life, do you have social circles? Do you hold yourself accountable to that? And I know it sounds weird to be like, hold yourself accountable to have fun and be social, but we get exhausted and then we start to shut down, and the first things that go are social life, hobbies, right? And so it's holding yourself accountable. For me, it's playing volleyball, and there are some nights where I'm like, I do not want to go to volleyball, right? But the minute I get there, no one is related to my job. We're having fun, we're laughing, I exercise, I'm outside. I always feel better afterwards, right? And so again, what does your social support look like? Because that's a huge protective factor that we overlook often. Adequate training we've talked about, and then diversifying responsibilities is huge. What types of stories do you cover? Can you advocate for, instead I want to do something happy, or I don't want to do crime on this one, can I cover this type of story? So again, can you be creative in that? For me, I was able to start doing this type of training while I was more heavily involved in the task force in North Dakota. My supervisor was like, hey, I know that this is important to you. Instead of constantly training and talking about trauma and victimization and all these horrific things, why don't you also go talk to people about how to help themselves, right? That diversified what I was responsible for within my role. That got me out of the heavy crime, heavy trauma all the time, and I could do something that filled my bucket, right? That made me feel better too. You even being here, that's a diversifying of your responsibilities, that you take a break from the norm and can come be at a conference. So how can you do that? How can this be more of an ongoing conversation within your organization? So things just to consider going forward. Where are you at? I'm assuming by now you've assessed a little bit about where you're at. What are your warning signs? What strategies work? And how do you have an intervention plan? Okay. So with that, you will get tons of resources for that. But what I want to just mention, which I think by now is obvious, but avoidance creates burnout. So we have to be willing to experience these negative emotions, have negative conversations to really help ourselves, okay? So just being aware of that we have to work through some of this. We can't talk about it, we can't emote about it. There's a lot of self-assessments that exist. Again, can you do these things in your organization? Will you hold yourself just accountable to do this on your own? So these are just a few examples. You'll get copies of some of these. The first one is an app you can put on your phone. It just tracks your next vacation. It tracks, or it has like different quotes and recipes. It tracks, how you're doing. You can take a personal assessment, I think, once a week on there, and it'll tell you how you're doing. So those exist. 5-minute, what's draining you, what's taking away your time, and this one on here that's called What's Draining You, it'll tell you what's all in your mind that's taking up too much space. So I think the first time I ever took this, it was like 80% of my day was being drained by all this stuff, and the goal is like, where do you want that percentage to be, which of course for everyone would be like as close to 0 as possible. So little things like this. And then that middle one I love, that you'll get signs and symptoms, because with that you're assessing your body and the connection. In social working world we call it like your somatic response, your somatic connection. You have a connection between the stress or what's going on in your brain and how that impacts your body. So for me, when I'm very highly stressed, my migraines are out of control. Okay, what we tend to do is say not relate it to the stress at work or the trauma that we're going through and say, oh, that's just who I am, I just have to tough it out, I've always had stomach issues, I've always had migraines. It could be directly related to the stress and the trauma you're experiencing at work. Okay, so just paying more attention to some of these symptoms within your body. And again, if you're seeking mental health, it can be bringing it there and saying, how can this be connected, right? What are the connections? How can I alleviate some of this? Because if we're just taking care of part of it or saying, oh, it's depression and anxiety. Sure, it might be, but if we're still not addressing the trauma associated with it, we're not going to get anywhere, okay? So another idea here is what are your warning signs? So what do you want to be like, or what are you like in your green? I would also encourage you not only to talk about this, kind of some internal dialogue, bring this up at work, bring this up at home, okay? So of course in the green, you're eating well, you're exercising, you're getting enough sleep, those types of things. Yellow, where you're kind of falling off a little bit. For me, I start to get impatient and irritable with people like close to me. A really honest example is like if my sister calls and is complaining about her kids. Normal thing, right? We all do. She's my sister, of course she's gonna call and vent to me about that. But if I've had a lot of really yucky cases or things happening, in my mind I'm like, oh my God, like I put her on mute. And in my mind, I'll think things like, well, your kids weren't raped today, okay? Kind of a good day you're having. Like, that's what I want to say, because I'm so frustrated. I'm like, you have no idea what the world is like, right? Like, just this frustration of, like, when our work gets to be too much, where I just get so mad. Like, people have no idea, right? And you guys have that too. People don't understand really the world in the way we do. And that's not their fault, right? But that's my yellow, is when I start like having those conversations in my head, and it's like, okay, that's not very kind, right? My red is emotional eating. I am a distracting, busy person. So what is that for you, where you're like really at your wit's end, where things aren't gonna go well? I was once in a break room, like working, and we always got donuts donated because we're a nonprofit, and that's kind of like, thanks for what you do. And my supervisor finally slid the box away from me, and she's like, "You've had 6." And I mean, I had no idea. I ate 6 donuts in like 5 seconds. I'm like emailing and working and taking calls. And that's not unusual for me when I'm really, really stressed and overwhelmed, okay? And that's something I have to pay a lot of attention to, because if that's happening, then next is like the uncontrollable tears and all of these just things, not sleeping, that come with that for me. And one time I was working a case, this youth was in California. They were going to discharge her back to North Dakota with no plan. And it was like 2 in the morning. I'm still trying to figure it out. My partner came out and he was like, "You need to go to bed." And I started sobbing. And this was before the pregnancy where I was emotional. Like, this was back, I just wasn't a big crier. And I said, "If I don't do anything, she is going to die tonight." I had, like, what? That just, and I was like, whoa. I didn't even know that was like going on inside of me, but I've had that happen to clients before. It must have been some weird subconscious thing I was stuffing away and was in my red zone that I didn't know was there, okay? So it's those things that we want to avoid getting to start picking up on your warning signs. And again, this will look different. Like when I brought this up at work, their idea of what my warning signs were and what they see was very different than my own thoughts on it. And it was super helpful for all of us, because then they understood when they needed to come ask, like, "Melissa's eating 6 donuts, guys. Who's going to go ask if she's okay?" Right? Like, they knew that. And then I also knew how to better ask for help, those types of things. So have these conversations at work and at home as well. And that's just what this slide is about, right? We have to have some mutual empathy of your partners, your family, your friends. Yes, you have a tough job, but then they get the aftermath of that. So we also need to empathize with them, right? We're gone holidays, we get called out, we have unpredictable hours. That's not fun for them either, just as much as it's not fun when they don't understand a tough day for our world, right? And coming home and they not knowing what we've been through, and hey, I need you to help me with this, and why don't you do that, and you're being mean to the kids, right? So we have to find that space of mutual empathy and have these hard conversations about how do you transition from work to home? What does that look like? How can we better support each other? What is my red zone, okay? And then another strategy is just, this is like a quick journaling, just food for thought, for internal dialogue. What's the narrative in your mind before you go to work, right? What feelings are associated with when you go to work? Do you like that narrative? How would you like that to change? In the most stressful moments, what would you like that to be? So again, just some things. If you're a journaler, this is a good strategy or something to think about. And with self-care too, it's, people always say it's bubble baths and wine, right? See, laughing is a good one, right? So when I was a supervisor, I always had a meme on my agendas each week, right? I always send out Friday, have a good Friday, and I would send a funny video. We would do employee of the week, and we'd all acknowledge who, the employee of the week, and I had this old crappy high school trophy, and we would pass that around. You can make acknowledgement fun and laughter. We had a bulletin board, and if you saw something really cool that a colleague did, you'd put a little sticky note and put it on the bulletin board, like, hey, Melissa did this week. Those are really easy things to do, right, to acknowledge each other. But true self-care is discipline. Everyone's like, it's wine, it's bubble baths, it's shopping. That's a small part of it, but you have to hold yourself accountable to sleep, picking up on your time management. Is that struggling the more stressed I get, or am I over-scheduling myself? Spirituality is a big one. What does that mean for you? Is that church? Is that being outside in nature, right? Meditation? Health, wellness, fun, and laughter. What motivates you? Even if that's different every day, that can be how you start your day, right? What's motivating me today? And then forgiving yourself. Again, a lot of guilt I heard yesterday. We have to have some compassion. You guys have hard jobs, okay? A few other tools I'm just going to point out before we move on to questions. These are some really easy ones. You'll have the low impact debriefing. It's basically just that, again, so you're not word vomiting like I did. Just a quick little tool on that. Hot walk and talk is another one if you're having a moment where you want to come in the break room and word vomit or vent about a colleague or a decision made on behalf of your organization. Drinking water and walking is scientifically proven to calm us down, right? So just pulling a colleague aside and saying, hey, let's just take a walk around the building and bring your coffee, bring your water with you. It sounds silly, but law enforcement and prosecutors actually tell me they love this one because it's easy, it's quick, they can all do it. It's a really quick culture change in the workplace thing. This website, when I was in North Dakota, this was one of the things we started. It's a really quick tool. You could email this out even, and if you hover your mouse over each one of these, it gives you what it is. So you could even say, hey, let's talk about these next week, or hey, you just email them out saying, hey everyone, here's some food for thought on some tools to take care of yourself. Really, there's tons of these that exist that are really, really easy that you guys can utilize in the workplace. So lastly then, when we're thinking about organizational change, it's both of our responsibilities. What I see a lot is organizations say, well, they're not taking care of themselves, they're not leaving work at work, and for the employer, it's kind of blaming the organization on everything, and it's definitely a 50-50. Obviously, the more we take care of our employees and each other, we have less turnover, the more resilient we are, the more money we save because we're not having as much turnover. We feel supported, positive, that before work narrative is really healthy. Those are really great things, right? And the community success. Think about if you have a great running newsroom, the community benefits from that too, and that's ultimately the passion that you guys have. So thinking about who at work can you go to with this information? How can you start making change? Even if they're not in leadership, who has a lot of influence in your organization, right? That you can take this to and brainstorm. Or can you suggest, hey, let's have an acknowledgement board where we just give kudos to people each week. Little things like that can go a long way. And with that, I think too, things like coming to this is really important. Hearing from survivors of the work that you guys do can be really rejuvenating and a lot of acknowledgement and training. So bringing in survivors of crime is really important. There is a National Journalism Day, I found out. Do we celebrate that? Do you guys know that? Maybe this is old news. There's a National Journalism Day. You guys should know that. I know that, okay? Like March is Social Worker Month. So do we know that? Are we acknowledging that? And do we do something fun in the office that day? It's little things like that too. And so again, thinking about what motivates you. For me too, I think everyone should have a feel-good folder. Like if I get a kudos email, if a client writes me a thank you note, if someone drew me a picture, a foster kiddo I worked with drew me a picture, I have a feel-good folder, and it all goes in there, okay? So little things like that. What makes you want to be here at work every day? And lastly, bring this back to the newsroom too. Also, this is something you can try to start your day with, right? Why did I sign up for this? Whose lives have I touched? What unique quality do I bring to the work? Because the last thing I want to happen is for someone to not want to work with me. And so that's something I ask myself a lot is, if I came to me for help, would I want to work with myself? Or would I want to be my own spouse today, my own child, my own friend? Okay, and sometimes the answer is no, and then it's, well, what do I need to change about myself? What's going on? Because we want to feel good about the work we do every day. And so asking yourself, why did I sign up for this? Having these conversations at work is really, really powerful and rejuvenating when we have tough days, tough weeks. Okay, I did it. Or am I behind schedule? Oh, good. Okay, we're good. What do we have? Any questions?
Hi, my name is Paris Flanagan. I'm with KTC out of Lafayette. My question is, how do you balance, I have a horrible habit. I put the story over my safety. Mm-hmm. So I'm the type of person who wants to go knock on the doors, ask the tough questions. Mm-hmm. And recently I wanted to go and knock on the door on the woman who shot the chief of police and his wife. My news director said, no. Mm-hmm. If she can shoot the police chief and his wife, what do you think she's going to do to you? But the whole entire day I felt like a failure, because I was like, a real reporter would have went and knocked on her door. Mm-hmm. And asked the tough questions. Mm-hmm. And I didn't do that. So how do you mitigate that and try to stop calling myself a failure every day because of not knocking on her door? Yeah, the guilt is the most toxic emotion, guilt and shame. And I would say a few things. I'm certain you'd get support from your colleagues in that decision. So I would always lean on the support of colleagues to help normalize that. If you have a table of people saying, yeah, I wouldn't have done that either, that can help alleviate some of that. And however it looks for you, we have to find the self-forgiveness, self-compassion piece. And again, this answer is hard because it's not like, here's a book that will fix that, because it's that internal guilt we need to work through. But I've had to work a lot with the self-compassion piece. I do that same thing. And I did the best I could today with what I had.
right? Or you have to put yourself first. That feels really yucky to a lot of us. And it's, again, leaning on people that can help you make those decisions easier. That for me, I felt more helpful with the guilt piece, because you'll keep yourself up at night, right, if you keep doing that. So thank you for the question. I think a lot of people would find that quite relatable. Yeah.
Catherine Reed at Unfiltered with Kieran. So I've worked in a lot of different corporate settings, and sometimes you have people who are okay with sharing their emotions, and then you have some people who are like, no, this is
Yes.
just a job, I don't want to talk about it. How do you balance both? You know, because there are moments where people are oversharing their emotions, and that can be toxic.
Yes.
But on the other hand, when you're bearing everything down, that is also super toxic. So where do we meet in the middle?
That's a great question. There's one thing I talk about when I have more time, and it sounds corny, but it's called no slime zone. And the idea is come up with a word or a phrase within your organization. So if someone is like, it is toxic to your point if they say too much, or it's like, okay, we get it, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole, right? Our job isn't our therapist in that way. So do you have some type of saying that you can be like, hey, remember everyone, this is a no slime zone, or, you know, just put it up on the wall? And again, I know that's a corny phrase, but people have come back and said this actually works, because it's a non-confrontational way to remind people of those things, because you're right. And I think too, in leadership, that is a responsibility of someone in leadership to have those conversations, to say, hey, you know, it sounds like maybe you need a little bit more emotional support than we provide at this job. Are you seeking that, right? And having those conversations. On the flip side, for people who are not wanting to talk about it, like you said, that's okay too. We're not all sharers. I would say there should be different means to meet everybody's comfortability. So if group setting isn't comfortable, are you still not saying, oh, well, we talked about it, so we should all be good? You should follow up in email. You should follow up one-on-one. You should follow up phone call, because everyone is going to connect differently or want to share or not differently. And so we should be giving all of the tools to allow people to do that in the way that's comfortable for them. Same with the tools I gave today. I have tons more if you guys want them, because some are going to appreciate an email that gives strategies. Some are going to appreciate doing a personality assessment with a full group and then talking about that. So we have to find ways to meet everybody where they're at. Yeah, good questions. Any other? Nobody wants to share their emotions? Come on, with the whole group.
Please join me in thanking Melissa
Yeah,
for...
thank you all.